I bought a book recently. Not an important book, not a book for work, not a book that's going to make me better with money, improve my communication skills, or finally explain what highly effective people are apparently doing before breakfast. I just wanted to read it. Which sounds like a complete explanation until somebody asks, "What's it for?" And suddenly, "I wanted to read it" feels strangely unfinished. So you start helping. I've always been interested in the subject. Better. Might be useful someday. Excellent. Now we're getting somewhere. It gives me a different perspective on things. Perfect. The book has been approved. And this happens in much bigger ways, of course. But what interests me is how small it can be. You learn a language. Are you moving? No. Is it for work? No. Then, why? You buy a camera. Starting a photography business? No. Content? No. Then what are you going to do with it? Apparently, taking photographs is no longer the obvious answer. You spend an afternoon learning something completely unnecessary. You drive somewhere because you've never been there. You make something nobody asked for. You take a day off without having constructed a sufficiently impressive activity to place inside it, and somewhere in the background, a tiny administrative process begins. Purpose? Expected outcome? Return on time invested? Because apparently wanting to do something is now less of a reason and more of an application awaiting supporting documentation. And I don't think anybody officially decided this. There was no meeting where we agreed that every hour of adult life should arrive with a short paragraph explaining its intended use. Most of the time, the question, why, is completely reasonable. Why are you spending the money? Why are you taking the time? Why are you learning this? Why are you going there? These are useful questions. But useful questions can become strange when they're asked so automatically that we stop noticing what they're replacing. Because sometimes the answer really is, I wanted to. Not because it will become a career, not because it will improve your health, not because it will generate income, strengthen your network, develop a transferable skill, or produce a fascinating anecdote for a future job interview. You just wanted to. And maybe the interesting question isn't why adults need reasons. Of course we do. Maybe it's something slightly different. When did wanting something stop feeling like enough of one? This is Punchline Protocol, the human layer of Protocol Multiverse. Here, we start with the ordinary experience, the small things you notice in your own life before you necessarily know what they mean. Dark Side Protocol looks at the systems underneath those experiences. Debrief Protocol connects the layers and asks what becomes visible when you look at both together. Different perspectives, same investigation. Here we stay with the human part. The interesting thing is that we already know which answers work. If you say you're learning Spanish because you enjoy the sound of it, that's nice. If you say you're learning Spanish because it might help your career, suddenly the activity has structural integrity. You're not just spending Tuesday evenings conjugating verbs, you're investing in yourself. Go for a run because you like running, and you've gone for a run. Go for a run because it improves cardiovascular health, reduces stress, and increases productivity. And congratulations, your legs are now part of a strategic development program. Cook something complicated because you feel like it, and you've spent 3 hours making dinner. Call it a mindfulness practice, a cultural exploration, or a way to improve your relationship with food, and the same 3 hours begin looking suspiciously responsible. Even rest has learned the trick. Apparently, we no longer sleep because we're tired. We optimize recovery. We don't take walks. We regulate our nervous systems. We don't sit quietly doing absolutely nothing. We practice intentional stillness. Which is useful, because doing nothing was beginning to look terrible on the quarterly report. And none of these explanations are necessarily false. Running really is healthy. Languages really can help careers. Rest really does improve performance. The strange part is how quickly adding a function makes an activity feel more legitimate, almost as if enjoyment itself is still allowed. But it helps enormously if it arrives carrying a letter of recommendation from productivity. Maybe that's why certain explanations feel more adult than others. I enjoy it describes an experience. It's good for me describes a return. I'm curious leaves the destination open. It might be useful gives the destination a job. And once an activity can point toward an outcome, it becomes much easier to defend, not only to other people, but to ourselves. That's important, because most of this conversation probably isn't happening out loud. Nobody is standing outside your house demanding quarterly justification for the guitar in your bedroom. We learn to ask the questions ourselves, before buying it, before starting, sometimes before admitting that we want it. What will I do with this? Where will it lead? Is this worth the time? And again, those aren't bad questions. The problem isn't that we learn to calculate value. The interesting part is that calculation may have quietly become the language we use to recognize value in the first place. And once you notice that language, you start hearing it everywhere. A hobby becomes a side project. A side project becomes a potential business. Reading becomes self-education. Exercise becomes performance. Travel becomes personal growth. Meeting people becomes networking. Even having an interesting conversation can apparently become building social capital, which is a remarkably efficient way to make friendship sound like infrastructure. We seem unusually talented at taking things that already had a reason to exist and giving them a second reason that can survive a spreadsheet. You like making bread? Wonderful. Have you thought about selling it? You take good photographs? You should start an Instagram page. You're good with children? Maybe you could monetize that somehow, although hopefully not in the way that sentence initially sounded. You enjoy fixing old bicycles? There must be a business model in there somewhere. And the funny thing is that these suggestions are often meant as compliments. We're saying, you're good at this. This has value. But notice what happens to the word value. The moment something becomes useful, scalable, profitable, educational, or productive, its value becomes easier to describe. It becomes legible. It can point to an outcome and say, that's what I'm for, which leaves the original answer standing slightly awkwardly in the corner. I make bread because I like making bread. Yes, obviously. But what are you going to do with it? And maybe that's the conversion worth paying attention to. Not everything has become work. Not every hobby has been monetized. Most people still do plenty of things for no impressive reason at all. But we have become extremely fluent at translating private value into functional value. Enjoyment becomes well-being. Curiosity becomes learning. Rest becomes recovery. Friendship becomes connection. Play becomes development. And sometimes that translation is genuinely useful. It helps us protect time, explain choices, and recognize benefits we might otherwise ignore. But translation can also change which language begins to feel legitimate. If "I like this" repeatedly becomes stronger when translated into "this is useful," eventually usefulness starts sounding like the original language and enjoyment like the rough draft. The activity hasn't changed. The person hasn't changed. Only the explanation has. And yet somehow the explanation can determine whether the time feels well spent or merely spent. Money makes this easy to notice because spending money has always invited explanation. Spend $2,000 on a laptop for work and nobody needs much context. Spend $2,000 on something you simply enjoy and suddenly the purchase develops a small legal team. But time may be even more interesting. Because adults don't only spend money carefully. We become remarkably suspicious of hours that cannot produce evidence of where they went. Spend Saturday fixing the house and Saturday has a result. Clean garage, painted wall, repaired shelf. Spend Saturday working and there are emails, invoices, tasks completed. Exercise for 2 hours and your watch can produce charts confirming that the afternoon did, in fact, occur. But spend 2 hours reading about something you'll never use, walking somewhere without a destination, trying to draw badly, listening to an album without simultaneously cleaning the kitchen, or sitting with somebody talking about absolutely nothing important, and the time can feel strangely difficult to account for. What did you do today? Not much, which is often completely inaccurate. You did plenty. It just didn't leave behind anything particularly useful to submit as evidence. No completed task, no improvement metric, no object, no achievement, no before and after photograph. Just 2 hours that happened to be enjoyable while they were happening. Apparently, time like that leaves the building without requesting a receipt. And this is where I think the question becomes more interesting than productivity. Productivity is easy to criticize. Everybody already knows what an overloaded calendar looks like. But this can happen even when nobody is forcing us to be productive. You can have free time and still feel a strange pressure to make the free time count. To use the weekend properly. To make the holiday memorable. To turn the hobby into progress. To come back from rest improved enough to justify having rested. The pressure isn't always do more. Sometimes it's subtler. Make sure this time means something. Give it an outcome. Give it a story. Give it evidence. Which is strange because an hour is one of the few things that disappears whether you justify it or not. The question is whether every hour needs to leave something behind before we're willing to believe it had value. And eventually, this logic stops evaluating only activities. It starts evaluating versions of you. Because once time needs to produce something, the obvious next question is what exactly it is producing in you. Read fiction, and maybe you're developing empathy. Travel, and you're broadening your perspective. Learn pottery, and you're improving patience, creativity, and fine motor skills. Spend an evening with friends, and you're maintaining important social relationships. Sit alone doing nothing, and with sufficient confidence, you can probably call it emotional regulation. There is almost no human activity that cannot be rescued by attaching a developmental outcome to it, which is convenient because now even pleasure can remain respectable as long as it eventually reports to personal growth. And again, none of this is nonsense. Experiences really do change us. Skills really do accumulate. Relationships really do need attention. But imagine applying the same standard to everything you love. Every book should make you wiser. Every conversation should deepen you. Every trip should transform you. Every hobby should improve you. Every difficult experience should teach you something. Every quiet afternoon should restore you. Apparently, even wasting time should, at minimum, produce a valuable lesson about why you shouldn't waste time. It becomes surprisingly difficult to simply have an experience without immediately assigning it a role in the ongoing construction project called yourself. And maybe that's where usefulness becomes especially persuasive, because self-improvement feels like a very generous justification. You're not being selfish, you're developing. You're not wasting time, you're becoming. But a life interpreted entirely through development has an unusual side effect. The present keeps being asked to explain what it is doing for the future. This book matters because of who you'll become after reading it. This exercise matters because of the body it may produce. This course matters because of the opportunities it may create. This rest matters because of tomorrow's performance. The future receives the benefit, and the present submits the paperwork. Again, planning for the future isn't the problem. A great deal of adult life depends on doing exactly that. But if every valuable experience needs to improve the person who comes next, there is a quiet question hiding underneath all of it. Does the person who exists right now ever get to want something that isn't trying to become anything else? The problem is that some of the best things in life are terrible at this. They refuse to scale. They don't improve efficiently. They produce almost nothing you can point to afterward. You can spend 5 years playing guitar and remain impressively average. You can learn enough Italian to order dinner, forget half of it, relearn it, and somehow never convert the experience into a marketable asset. You can cook elaborate meals that disappear in 20 minutes. Grow tomatoes that cost considerably more than tomatoes. Read hundreds of pages about a historical event nobody in your office will ever ask about. Walk the same route because you like the trees there. Spend an evening playing a game you will never become particularly good at. Build something badly, throw it away, then build another one slightly less badly for no reason beyond the fact that the process makes Tuesday more interesting. These activities have an almost offensive lack of ambition. They don't necessarily lead anywhere. They don't promise leverage. They don't become passive income while you sleep. Some of them barely become active competence while you're awake, and yet people keep doing them, which suggests that perhaps human beings have always understood a category of value that becomes strangely difficult to describe once the first question is, what do I get from this? Because not everything valuable is valuable afterward. Some things concentrate almost all of their value inside the experience itself. The conversation was valuable while you were having it. The walk mattered while you were walking. The music mattered while you were listening. The ridiculous little project mattered while your hands were occupied with it. Afterwards, there may be nothing to show. And that's precisely why these things are difficult to defend using the language we've been discussing. Outcomes survive the activity. Experiences often don't. A certificate remains. A salary increase remains. A finished renovation remains. A measurable improvement remains. But an enjoyable hour can disappear almost completely, except for the fact that, for 1 hour, you enjoyed being alive. That's an unusually weak business case. It's also possible that we've confused difficulty measuring value with absence of value. And those are very different things. Which brings us back to the answer we started with. Because I wanted to. It's a strange little sentence because it doesn't point anywhere beyond itself. Why did you read the book? Because I wanted to. What did you get from it? I enjoyed reading it. Yes, but what did you get from it? Apparently, we may need to go around again. The answer can feel almost childish, and maybe that's part of what makes it uncomfortable. Children are remarkably comfortable wanting things without producing a supporting argument. Why are you drawing that? Because I want to. Why are you digging a hole? Because we're digging a hole. What are you going to do with the hole? This question has clearly been asked by somebody who doesn't understand the project. Adults, meanwhile, become much better at attaching reasons to desire. We don't just want the expensive bicycle. It's an investment in health. We don't want to spend a weekend alone. We need to recharge. We don't want to take a pointless trip. We need a change of environment. We don't want to spend 6 months learning something obscure. We're expanding our skill set. Sometimes these explanations are true. Sometimes they're simply the formal clothing desire puts on before entering an adult building. Because I wanted to can sound indulgent. This is good for me sounds responsible. Same person, same desire. Much better paperwork. But wanting isn't automatically wise. That's worth saying clearly. People want things that are expensive, destructive, impulsive, selfish, and occasionally spectacularly stupid. Desire does not become correct merely because it exists. Responsibilities still matter. Consequences still matter. Other people still matter. The point isn't that because I wanted to should override every other consideration. The interesting part is that we may have quietly moved much further than that. We don't only ask desire to survive consideration. Sometimes we ask it to provide a respectable reason before consideration is even allowed to begin. And those are different standards. One says, you can want this, but let's decide whether acting on it makes sense. The other says, explain why wanting it deserves our attention in the first place. Maybe that's why harmless desires can sometimes arrive already apologizing for themselves. They haven't asked us to change our lives. They haven't cost anything yet. They haven't even become decisions. And somehow they're already preparing an answer to the question, yes, but what is this for? And perhaps that's why genuinely pointless things can feel almost rebellious now. Not dramatic rebellion, Nobody is overthrowing civilization by assembling a model airplane badly on Sunday afternoon. But there is something unusual about choosing an activity while knowing perfectly well that it will probably remain exactly what it is. You won't monetize it. You won't master it. You won't build an audience around it. You won't use it to reinvent yourself at 47. There will be no transformation montage. You may not even improve very much. You'll just keep doing it because, for reasons that are difficult to place in a spreadsheet, you like the person you are while you're doing it. And maybe that's what disappears when everything needs a reason. Not pleasure itself. Adults still have pleasure. Not hobbies. We still have hobbies. What disappears is a certain category of permission. The permission for something to occupy time without promising to justify the occupation later. Because once every interest needs a destination, activities that don't lead anywhere begin looking incomplete. But maybe they aren't incomplete. Maybe not leading anywhere is sometimes the entire design. A dinner doesn't fail because eventually the plates are empty. A conversation doesn't fail because nobody received a certificate. A walk doesn't fail because you arrived where you started. Some experiences complete themselves simply by happening. And responsibility doesn't disappear because we admit that. There are still bills, there are still deadlines, there are still children who require feeding with an unreasonable degree of regularity. There are still things worth building, skills worth developing, and futures worth preparing for. A functioning life cannot be constructed entirely from beautiful afternoons with no measurable outcome. That's not the argument. The trade-off is real. Time given to one thing cannot be given to another. Money spent here cannot be spent there. Sometimes the answer to, "Can I do this just because I want to?" genuinely has to be no. But no and "you need a better reason for wanting it" are not the same answer. One recognizes a constraint. The other quietly changes the standard by which desire is allowed to count. And perhaps that's the distinction worth keeping. You don't need to obey every desire. You don't need to turn every curiosity into action. But maybe a harmless want should be allowed to exist before it is required to defend its contribution to the person you're supposed to become. So maybe the strange thing isn't that adults became practical. We had to. Time became limited. Money became consequential. Other people entered the equation. Choices began competing with other choices, and because I felt like it, quite reasonably stopped winning every argument. But somewhere along the way, we may have confused not always being enough to determine a decision with not being enough to constitute a reason. Those are very different things. You can want something and still decide against it. You can enjoy something and still decide it's too expensive. You can be curious and still have no time. You can desperately want to spend Thursday afternoon constructing a medieval trebuchet in the garden and still recognize that the neighbors, your employer, and possibly several local regulations have entered the discussion. None of that makes the original desire meaningless. It simply means desire was one piece of the decision, rather than the entire decision. And perhaps that's what we've been circling this whole time. We became so accustomed to defending what we do through outcomes that we started asking desire to produce an outcome before we'd even let it count. Because I wanted to didn't become irrational. It became insufficiently documented. And I'm not telling you to waste more time. I'm not telling you to buy the camera, learn Italian, take the trip, quit optimizing your sleep, or dedicate the next 18 months to becoming the region's least commercially successful amateur potter. I don't know what deserves your time. Neither does a YouTube video. I'm only pointing at a small question that seems to follow adults around with surprising persistence. What's it for? Sometimes that question protects us. Sometimes it clarifies what matters. Sometimes it stops us doing something spectacularly stupid. But perhaps it doesn't need jurisdiction over everything. Some things can be useful. Some things can build the future. Some things can improve you. And some things may be allowed to occupy a small piece of a finite life for the deeply unimpressive reason that you liked them while they were happening. No measurable outcome, no strategic advantage, no future version of yourself waiting to collect the return. Maybe because I wanted to was never a weak reason. Maybe we just stopped treating wanting as evidence. If this felt familiar, you probably don't need to reorganize your life around it. That's not really what we do here. We take ordinary parts of being human, the questions, habits, and tiny assumptions that usually pass unnoticed, and hold them still long enough to see what they've been doing. Sometimes the result is useful. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. And sometimes it simply makes an ordinary sentence sound slightly different the next time you hear it. If that's your kind of investigation, stay around. There are plenty of ordinary things left to make strange. So no homework, no challenge to reclaim your joy, no list of 5 intentionally pointless activities to complete before next Tuesday. Just the next time you hear yourself asking, "What's this for?" Maybe notice whether the thing in front of you actually needs an answer. Because sometimes it will. Sometimes the reason will matter. And sometimes, quietly, without becoming productive, transformative, or useful. Because I wanted to may already be the whole answer. The ideas are human. The narration is digital. The interpretation has always been yours.